Thank you, Professor Hubbard, for being here. Let's start with a macro perspective on politics. And while elections reveal winners and losers, they also reveal evolving voter dynamics. So, what do you think surprised you the most about this election?
Well, it's a great question. First, I should note, you're here for the Adam Smith Society. If you love Adam Smith, come hang with Tano Santos and me in January for Political Economy, small commercial. To your question, I'm surprised how much people are surprised. So I can't claim to be clairvoyant, but I definitely called this one. What I missed was the magnitude. I got the sign right on the arguments for reasons I'll say in a minute, but I'm surprised how many people are surprised, because what that says to me is that elites on both sides, it's not a partisan statement, whether you're a Democrat elite or traditional Republican elite, just didn't see this coming. The second thing that surprised me is the commonly held view that this election means that populism reigns supreme forever. That is just not necessarily true at all. On the surprise part, an example I like to use is my favorite line during the financial crisis actually came from the Queen of England, the late Queen of England, who asked the LSE faculty, why did nobody see it coming? And I think what the Queen was asking is, how can kind of obvious, big, slow-moving things materialize and experts miss it? And I think part of the problem was people weren't focused on the subject of the conversation we're having this afternoon about the problems of average people. Seems obvious, but completely had befuddled the elites. On populism, I actually think just the opposite. We are about to enter a potential period of what I called in the Wall Street Journal last week an awakening. And I use the example of the religious awakenings because it was connecting traditional ideas, in that case of Christianity, with a broader audience. And here I think standard conservative neoliberal ideas have a whole new way of being framed in terms of economic growth and opportunity and participation. So those are my two surprises, that people are surprised and that they think the world's changed forever.
Okay. As a follow-up to that, we've seen some historically Democratic-leaning groups shift Republican this time around. But at the same time, we also saw that in states where Trump won, the Senate seats were still won by Democrats who contested there. So do you think political polarization has peaked, or do you think there is more room to go?
I think it's a mixed story. So not everything followed what you just said. So for example, Sherrod Brown lost in Ohio, which Trump carried by a lot. I do think that the higher up you get to national office, like the presidency, people vote on big themes. And so I could imagine that somebody could say, well, I will go along with what Donald Trump is saying. But when you get closer to the ground of my congressman or my senator, and what is he or she going to do for me, then I think people are a little more discerning about particular issues. So I think we have polarization. That's not particularly going away. Social media, I think, magnifies it in society. But I don't think the Republican Party ought to take heart by saying, well, Donald Trump's victory means happy days are here again. I think it might be a little more sui generis than that.
Okay. And as another follow-up to that, historically, Florida, for instance, has been a swing state, but we've seen a shift increasingly Republican. But what surprised me the most was that even Miami voted red this time around, and we've not historically seen urban centers vote red so strongly. So do you think these trends and these shifts are a little more permanent, or do you think they could reverse as soon as the next election?
I think nothing's ever permanent, but I think they're long-lasting for sure. I grew up in Florida, so when I was a boy, Florida was definitely a Democrat state. It became like almost all southern states were at the time, it became a swing state and now is pretty solidly Republican, because it's not just voting for Trump. If you look at the makeup of government in Florida, it's highly Republican. Remember that Florida has also gotten a lot of refugees from taxes from lots of other states who may come in with more of a conservative perspective. What was interesting to me is how well President Trump and Republican candidates did in Florida among minority groups, as well as white men and women. So I think it's a long-lasting shift.
Okay. Moving to a theme closer to your book about, wall policies being easier to erect and usually being the go-to, whereas bridges help foster longer-term growth and prosperity but are more difficult to move on to. Historically, economic frustration often fuels wall policies. We've seen that starting from Brexit, the whole America First administration under the first Trump policy. And coming to the current election, economic frustration has been at an all-time high because of inflation. How do you think the current administration, the new incoming administration, should react in terms of bridge policies over wall policies in this environment?
Well, it's a great question. And I should explain the metaphor I have in mind with the wall and the bridge. And by the way, it makes a great Christmas present. So if you're looking to buy hundreds of copies, I can make that easy for you from Yale Press. Now, in all seriousness, imagine growth as being the thing we all like. And nobody's against growth. It's your future living standards, it's mine. Anything you want to do in the future, whether it's the environment or defense or money for your family, whatever it is, it's made easier by growth. So there's reason that economists celebrate growth. We talk about growth all the time. But here's the dirty little secret. Despite what you think from your principles of economics books, growth doesn't happen in this kind of easy, linear way. It's highly disruptive. So imagine I'm holding a coin up, and the heads is growth, which is what we all like. The tails is disruption. And that's the political rub that Yash is asking about. So when you have this kind of disruption from growth and policies that encourage growth, politicians react to that. And in history, the traditional reaction has been a wall. It could be building a literal wall, like the build the wall policies we hear about here. It can be metaphorical too, like I don't like foreigners. I'm going to put up a war on immigrants, things like that. Anything that says if you don't like something, I will make it go away, that's a kind of wall. Walls don't work. They never really have. It's hard to even know what you want a wall for. Right now in society, politicians talk a lot about walls on trade, when technology, as we may talk about later, is clearly the bigger disruptive force. The wall won't even protect you from that. It may even accentuate it. So walls really don't work. The problem is they're an incredible bumper sticker. Build the wall. You don't like it, I'll make it go away. An alternative comes from schools of thought going back to classical liberalism, Adam Smith, why we're here, which is to say that what we could do is prepare people for opportunity. And those are bridges. Bridges do two things. They both connect you to something and they reconnect you. So imagine a set of policies that helped people prepare for the world that actually is, as opposed to a dream of going back 50 years ago, or reconnected them when they fall out of the boat. Those are a different way of approaching the same thing. We're likely to hear a lot more wall talk. We already are hearing a lot of wall talk, literal wall talk, but also anti-immigrant, antitrust policies, business is bad. All of these things come from walls. I'm hopeful that we will hear alternatives in bridges, basically, which we could talk about later if you like, but basically because the cost of walls is always very large. The costs of protectionism are borne by all of us. We've had great work done at Columbia, both here in the business school and in the economics departments by colleagues who show that essentially 100% of the costs of tariffs are borne by Americans. This isn't some magical pill where we get to ship our problems to foreigners. That's not the way the world works.
Thank you for that. I really like the analogy where, disruption is just another side of the coin of growth. And I definitely want to touch up on the disruption bit a little bit later. But talking about the wall and bridge policies and with a focus on the global economic policy and trade, what my question is going to be is, how do you see America taking advantage of the global decoupling that we are seeing in terms of, the China manufacturing strategy? How can America use this as an opportunity to build bridges instead of building walls with respect to global trade?
It's a great question, and it's the way he just asked the question is a way I always encourage business people to think. We are not going to decide political outcome. We can as voters, but once an outcome happens, it's us as business people will decide how do we react and deal with this. So to start with your question, Yash, first on China and decoupling, I'm never 100% sure what people mean by decoupling. So sometimes you see the analogy that came, example from Jake Sullivan, who was President Biden's national security advisor, who said, we need a small yard but a high fence, meaning we don't want to have too much in the way of walls, but when we want a wall, we want a really steep wall. And so for China, I could imagine there are some kinds of technologies, let's say related to national defense or maybe even to generative AI, and we would like to protect those. That said, I think we're probably less concerned about who makes children's toys or things that aren't mission critical. So I'm not sure that decoupling means you can't trade with China, but I do think China is going to be the first up, whether it's going to be very large tariffs or, for example, taking away China's accession to the World Trade Organization. What would worry me even more is to see that kind of policy followed across the board. Not to get too in the weeds with you, but the laws governing what you can do for a tariff almost always relate to national security. And so there's something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that gives the president fairly broad reason to impose tariffs as long as he uses the word national security. You could say that with China, I think, with some credibility in today's world. But when you say it's the whole world, it can't be the case that the entire world's a national security threat to the United States. If that's true, then we're in real trouble. So I think we're not likely to see the across-the-board tariffs.
Okay. As a follow-up to that, and you've always argued that tariffs outside national security concerns are suboptimal, but if the incoming administration was to impose tariffs, what would be the strategic way to go about doing that? And I think this is also a question of importance because the entire economic frustration over the past couple of years has been stemming out of inflation, and tariffs generally end up pushing domestic inflation higher. So how do you walk the thin line?
Yeah, I mean, let me start with your last point. So tariffs, I mean, technically speaking, putting on tariffs isn't inflationary the way economists use that word. Normally when we talk about inflationary, we mean raising the rate of inflation for an extended period of time. What a tariff is like a one-time change in the price level, so it'll be inflationary for a period of time. But that's politically salient for the reason you mentioned. A lot of people in the past election were saying, well, inflation's coming down, aren't voters happy? But of course, what voters were saying is the prices of things that I buy today are greater than the prices of those same things were in 2019. I'm mad. The tariff will lead to exactly that same kind of frustration. Tariffs also lead to things that economists talk about more than business people, which is sloppiness in productivity. A real discipline for domestic firms is the notion that if they're not efficient, there's overseas competitors who will come in and compete them away. That goes away with tariffs. And again, we all as consumers wind up paying that tax. There's a way to deal with the frustration. I give President Trump a lot of credit for honing in on a frustration that a lot of people had missed. That's what I led off with, why I wasn't surprised by the election result. But that said, I think what people were frustrated with is, why can't I and my family be prepared for this world? Why is it that you all are, because you're sitting in a very fortunate position, but I, this person, this swing voter, am not? Tariffs aren't answers to that question. There are lots of policies that are, and I hope the new administration will take a laser focus to those.
Thank you for that. That's actually a topic I want to touch, but I have one question before we move there. The first China shock in the 2000s, that was a major reason for unemployment and shifting protectionist policies. How high do you think is the risk of a second China shock, especially with recent advances in AI?
Well, it's interesting. So let's talk about the first China shock first. This comes from work by economists, the Otter, Dorn, and Hansen papers, some of you may have talked about in your GEE class and things like that, are very important here. What's interesting about the China shock, I think, are a few things. One is how quickly it came on the scene. There was the accession to China that straddles the end of the Clinton presidency and the beginning of George W. Bush's presidency. The second is how persistent the China shock happened. So once it happened, China's penetration in imports grew. The third is, and this is very important for the kind of political system the United States has, how geographically spread the China shock was. So the China shock was not a uniform shock to employment in the United States. It happened in particular areas, and they're areas that are correlated very heavily to the swing states in recent elections. So the China shock is a salient event. Now, before I answer your question about today, I would note that while the China shock has gotten a lot of attention from politicians and from many economists, it is not the most important development that hit either the economy or, in particular, politically salient, the labor market during this period. That goes to technology. So when economists talk about big structural disruptors, they should talk about two, say, since the Second World War. One is the advent of globalization, the other is technological advance. Technological advance is far more important. So caution to you, when you hear China shock, trade, we've got to protect against that. The big driver, even an industry like steel, what killed the US steel industry was much less trade and much more technology. The US firms called it wrong on the technology to make steel. Now, to today, the advent of potentially large tariffs from the US makes a traditional China shock much less salient. But China as an economic disruptor is clearly there. So for example, if we put very large tariffs on the Chinese, there will be tension between China and the European Union. For European Union manufacturers, China is by far their largest overseas market, in many industries even larger than the United States for them. And so there will be big economic disruption, but I think it's less likely to be the China shock in the way that we saw before. It is a problem for the party leadership in China, though, because the easy economic growth days for China, I think, are behind China if it's going to continue down the road, the status road that it's on.
Thank you. Moving forward to something that we discussed earlier, you've always stressed on the importance of education and using it as a bridge to make sure that people are able to transition. And since your book, I think this has become even more a topic of focus with AI and the growth that it brings, or disruption is at the forefront of what's being discussed. So how would you go about educating the workforce of the future and reskilling some of our existing workers so that they can manage the transition?
Great question. It's not a newsflash to have a college professor say education's important for your future, but I'm not particularly talking my book because I don't really have Columbia in mind for what I'm about to say. I mean, Columbia is great, but it's not either the problem or the solution to what I'm about to describe. Let me start with AI, because you mentioned that. Remember I mentioned in the context of the China shock, a quick onset, persistence, geographically spread out. AI is going to have some of those same developments. I think it's going to happen in terms of its penetration of the labor market faster than people think. Not to get too in the weeds with you, but when economists talk about big technical change, we focus on what we call general purpose technologies. Those are major changes that then carry around other technical changes. So in history, think of the internal combustion engine, electrification, mainframe computing, the internet getting closer to today, and now robotics, machine learning, artificial intelligence. When you have a general purpose technology shift, oftentimes it takes organizations a long time to adapt. The reason previous technologies took a while to get through to productivity in the economy was it took business people a long time to figure it out. So when I moved from mainframe computing to PCs, how do I do that? When you're talking about AI, that's actually an easier transformation for business than those technologies I mentioned. So I think this could occur very quickly. It's also going to be more disruptive in some sense than the previous technologies that affected mainly blue-collar work, not entirely men, but mainly men in those jobs. This is much more likely to affect men and women of various skills, some lawyers, some accountants, even some engineers. So this is very big. Now the question is how you prepare people. The first would be education, and the second organization. So in education, what I argued in the book is we need to take a lesson from the past. We used to do big things in the country to prepare people for the future. And the big thing we need to do now is realize that the educational institutions that are the foot soldiers of this are not really Columbia University, as wonderful a place as it is, but community colleges all over the country. Community colleges that are woefully underfunded. There are mechanisms to support community colleges, borrowing from Abraham Lincoln's intuition about land-grant colleges, that the problem is the supply side, not the demand side. Build more things. And by making community colleges stronger, we will prepare men and women for that future. And the good news about community colleges is they work very closely with local employers, local demand. They understand those skills. So I think that's going to be the way to go. And AI is only going to make it faster. Now, organizations. Businesses have real responsibilities here. Business people can't stand aside and say, how does something happen in politics? Where did that come from? If we sit around and wait for lots of people to get displaced by AI, we as business people are going to be in trouble. And I think it's very important for organizations to themselves participate in that kind of upskilling and reskilling. And there are already firms that are all over this, and I would urge more business people to take a look. Now, what I just said is not the unanimous consent of the economics profession. There's certainly economists who think this will go more slowly. But I think the idea of just pure risk management, saying, if it could be this fast and this disruptive, how do we get on top of it?
Okay. As a follow-up, we've already discussed about growth and disruption being two sides of the same coin, and technology in the past has exacerbated the process of just inequality within the country. But there is an opposing stream of thought that AI can actually help bridge the gap and help the lower productivity workers, because initial research suggests that AI is often more useful for workers with lower productivity than higher productivity. So do you think AI can actually be used, and technology can be used as a means of bridging the gap rather than this time causing the disruption in the first place?
I think it can be part of the solution, but it could go either way. I think it could be part of the solution in the way you mentioned, because AI can inform skills at all levels. That said, it does make the best people even more productive. So imagine that I'm the very best physician at something. My intuition, honed by my being the best, is now supplemented by all this AI. That's better than the 80th percentile physicians getting the same thing. So AI can help, but not entirely. And AI also raises questions in the industrial concentration about which firms are going to dominate AI. And does that mean we'll see even larger tech behemoths than we see today? So I view it as more of an open question.
Okay. And moving on to a little more about the opportunities that can shape this decade. I know in your book you talk about the land-grant colleges and the GI Bill being revolutionary in how they helped propel growth and prosperity. And I really like your point about community colleges being the avenue we need to focus on, because not everyone attends Columbia or the top colleges. But outside community colleges, what do you think are other avenues that can help shape this transition and be the bridge for the coming decades?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reason I centered on the land-grant colleges and the GI Bill is, to me, they were really talking about supply. So when you hear discussion of education today, it's largely about demand. Like, how do I give you enough financial aid to buy something? That's really not going to be a game changer in the same way supply was. The origin of the land-grant college movement was to bring skills for the nascent industry of the day, which was manufacturing. Agriculture was dominant, to communities around the country. The notion of the GI Bill was the economy is changing after the war. You have all these men and women coming home. How do you prepare them for that? We've lost that ability to think, when there's a major structural change, how to do it. Now, one element is community colleges, but there are others. So, for example, I think if I were talking to Doge, the new, dyad that's going to decide America's future, I would say more spending on research, not less. Basic research has enormous social returns. But also, to the point of your question, what if we put applied research centers around the country? The idea of the land-grant college movement was that every state would have a land-grant institution that could educate men and women and improve local economies We could be doing this with applied research centers around the country that would help translate cutting edge ideas into the latest in services, the latest in advanced manufacturing. We should think big like this. And we should also, a third level of that is think in a more holistic way about aid to places. Like many economists, I used to believe that place-based aid was silly, that if there are more opportunities in Nashville than there are in Youngstown, well, everybody ought to pack up their bags in Youngstown and go to Nashville. It turns out there's not nearly as much mobility and geographical mobility in society as many economists like to imagine. And I think there are ways to do place-based aid in a sensible way through block grants that, coupled with research centers and community college, could be today's version of something like the GI Bill or the land-grant college movement.
Professor Hubbard, you also mentioned that one of the major issues with community colleges is they are heavily underfunded. And I think talking about structural reforms, one of the major issues economically has also been the ballooning US debt. So do you think the US has the capacity to implement major structural reforms at this point, which might also add a heavy bill burden or tax burden to the people?
Sure we do. So if you go back, I can't remember the name of the book. It's a book about Lincoln's economic team that was out in the past year or so by Roger Lowenstein. But in any event, in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln tackles land-grant colleges, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad. These all sound like huge structural things in the middle of an existential budget and military crisis of the nation. We can do anything we want. The question is understanding the trade-off. So we fundamentally, as a society, the things that I've mentioned are not that costly. So you could do a 10-year major block grant for community colleges that would get graduation rates up to the levels that education reformers are looking for, on the order of $25 or $30 billion a year. I used to think that was real money. Today's Washington, that's like, money under the chair. So even small trade-offs that could be made would have, I think, a very, very big effect and a very big payoff, if only we dreamt big enough to talk about it.
That's a different perspective, and I appreciate that. Diving a little more into that and focusing more on economic participation, what are the most promising avenues that you see for economic participation in the coming decade?
Great question. Participation is a classical liberal idea of a good society. Going back to Smith and all classical liberal thinkers and today's thinkers as well, the notion of everybody being a participant in society is important. Oftentimes when economists talk about participation, they mean in a kind of disembodied way. Are you working? Are you getting paid? And that is an element of participation. But being a member of society is very important for people. If you look at political scientists' analysis of the elections we had in 2016, 2020, and my guess is they'll find the same thing for 2024, a lot of the patterns that you saw really reflected people's views about whether they could meaningfully participate in society. So how would you do that? Part is the preparation. That's the training, community colleges, and so on. But part is rewarding work. Making sure that we use the programs we have to reward work to really get people into the labor market. Many of our programs, at least in this country, for rewarding work are income support programs, and they're primarily aimed at people with families. We could do a lot better by aiming even more at childless workers, at younger people, getting them in the labor market. And we need to do more to support families to make sure people are able to work. So I think if we're serious about participation, we can do it. And notice everything I just said doesn't sound Republican or Democrat. I could name both Paul Ryan and Barack Obama both said essentially what I just said. So this shouldn't be difficult if we just put our minds to it.
I think your book also focuses on a more centrist view, and I think that definitely is the need of an hour. I think we're going to have one more question before we open it to the audience. And I know we touched a little on the decoupling and de-risking earlier, but because of global geopolitical tensions, we've seen a lot of firms decoupling from China and moving the production. Apple, for instance, a lot of the production has shifted to Vietnam and India. Do you think the US can use this as a strategic opportunity to bring some of that outsourcing back to the country? Or alternatively, do you think manufacturing is not an area of focus anymore and we should just focus on the next wave?
Well, it's very interesting. I think when people talk about bringing manufacturing back to the US, it's easier for me to imagine manufacturing activity in the US than manufacturing employment in the US. Todd and I were talking about this outside. Manufacturing, the good news and the bad news, depending on your point of view, has been the various highest productivity changed industry. And so manufacturing output is not what suffered in the US, it was manufacturing employment that suffered in the US. So if politicians mean we're going to bring jobs back to the US, I'm more skeptical about that. And nor do I think it's particularly important for national security reasons. If we're trading with friendly nations, that doesn't strike me as a national security problem. So if I were thinking about this from a business perspective, I'd be looking at where in the world would I imagine those opportunities to arise. And I think many businesses, whether they're Americans or others, are de-risking from China, in part because of fears of tariffs from the United States or maybe the European Union, but also the obvious geopolitical concerns.
Understood. Thank you, Professor Hubbard. This has been very insightful. We've covered a whole batch from like a global macro perspective to also domestic and foreign policy. We'd like to open it up to questions. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, this is Maya. I got a question. I'm just curious. No, thanks, man. I got a question. How concerned are you about the future independence of central banking and the judicial system in this country?
The judicial system, I'm not terribly concerned because of the way it's structured. The threats to the judiciary in the US are more if Congress were to decide to, pack the Supreme Court and allow that, I think that would be problematic, but neither party's been successful in actually doing that. The independence of the Fed is something that I worry about. The Fed has not always been the super independent central bank that we think of today. There was a time in Fed history when the Secretary of the Treasury played a very big role as well. And indeed, in the Dodd-Frank Act, a lot of the extraordinary lending programs that the Fed does in financial crises, in fact, have to be signed by the Secretary of the Treasury. And the Secretary of the Treasury is, by definition, a more political person. That is the president's direct appointee to do the president's bidding. So I think that is a concern. Politicians' bark has generally been worse than their bite over many decades on the Fed, but it's something to watch out for. Like anything else, the admonition I would give people is personnel is policy. And so whoever gets appointed to these jobs, that's going to be your clue over whether independence is prized. And who knows what that will be.
Okay, this doesn't worry you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Howie. I took the Bridging the American Prize class with Professor Jake, and we went to Youngstown a month ago. I think Youngstown is an example of a region that has really suffered a lot over the last couple of decades. But what I find interesting is that there are a lot of swing states that actually have economically done pretty good, especially over the last 4 years. So my question is, what would be necessary to make those states happier, or basically flip them back to Democrat, or make them happy with the established order, so to say?
Yeah, I mean, if I knew that, I'd be a famous political scientist. So I don't know, but I will say that economics plays a pretty big role in each of them because people do have memories, and those memories tend to anchor on a specific time. So for example, for decades in American agriculture, farmers anchored on World War I prices. This was a feature for decades. Like when I was a young person, that was still going on, even though it's insane. And so people you're talking about a prosperity turnaround in a few years, but if what you're anchored on is what life was like when your grandfather or grandmother was working, well, then that's a very different thing. And we can't necessarily put that genie back in the bottle. The way I see it, there was a piece recently by David Brooks in the New York Times, and I actually like the title better than the piece itself. The title was, "Do You See Me Now?" I think what a lot of these folks are saying is, do you see me? Do you hear my concerns? Are you focused principally on what's happening in New York and Los Angeles, places like that? Or do you see that we have concerns, whether it's Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio, whatever it happens to be? I think that's really the issue. But I think economics plays a very big role. One thing we know about swing states is they swing, right? So it's unlikely that they're all going to stay where they are now. It was kind of extraordinary that all 7 of the, quote, swing states went one way, albeit by margins that weren't necessarily large, but they all went the same direction.
Yeah, just a follow-up to that question in a way. So how do you see the impact on large cities like New York City as a obviously? Do you think, you hear these stories from, like that, New York or Los Angeles or what have you, but do you think, to the earlier question, I guess these other places are being seen, but large cities like New York, what's the plus?
Well, for New York, there are probably forces that are going to go in different directions. So, I don't know what the administration will do, but if the campaign themes of things like lighter touch regulation, continuation or expansion of pro-business tax policies, things like that are very New York friendly. So New York would definitely be a major beneficiary, and Wall Street would be a big beneficiary. On the other hand, I don't think the administration is necessarily that friendly to cities generally and to states like New York, despite the lobbying of things like bringing the state and local tax deduction back. I rather doubt they're going to open up the whole tax bill because that would bring back too many things. So I think for New York, as always, it'll be a mixed bag. The biggest concerns I have as somebody who's been a New Yorker for decades now are just that New York City and New York State need to get their act together, not just worrying about what happens in Washington. That strikes me as a heavy lift.
You were mentioning at the beginning that basically national security concerns might justify major tariff policies, and that might be the case against, for instance, China. But against other places in the world, such as the European Union, that argument doesn't prevail, I guess. So what is your opinion on what's the rationale to back such a aggressive economic policy that the administration is basically claiming that will endorse?
On China or the whole world? Oh, I can't see a justification. I would think a better thing to do is the World Trade Organization as an organizational form is probably not fit for purpose right now. And building a new coalition of the willing, as it were, and to me that would be United States, European Union, Australia, Japan, Canada, coming up with a core set of countries and build out from there. So it would strike me as the last thing I would do would be putting tariffs on a group of countries that I needed to be my friends, as opposed to the Chinese. But even with China, I think it's naive to say just decoupling, and I should have said more of this when I was speaking earlier. There are a lot of global public goods and bads in the world that absolutely depend on our cooperation with China. When you have climate change, that doesn't matter whether it's China, US, Europe, it's a global phenomenon. We can't do it without China. When we have pandemics, we need China. So I think we have to imagine what's an institutional structure that still allows us to cooperate on some things while realizing on others, like technologies for defense, we just can't. And I'm not sure the administration thinks like that, but I think it might help them if they did. Or at least that's one person's view.
Right, Professor, thank you for sharing your insights. If you are to position yourself, imagine yourself as a international talent, or you want to position yourself as a global talent residing in the United States in this quite an uncertain time, what kind of strategic mindset will you give yourself to kind of navigate through, to moving forward, whether it is to work or future kind of planning?
That's a great question. I have always felt that anybody pursuing higher education in the United States, maybe not lawyers, but everybody else, like science, business, whatever, we just staple green cards. I mean, some people say, you know, why would you want to help other people? I'm not trying to be a nice person. I would love it if every smart person in the world wanted to live in the United States. I mean, to me, as an American, that's a great outcome. So I don't understand at a very fundamental level the debate over high-skilled immigration. I do understand at a very fundamental low-skill immigration debate, but that's not about anybody in this room. What I've advised people is to think about a career ladder within a firm. You know, can you imagine starting here, going to another country, coming back? Immigration policy changes over time. So imagining firms and relationships that still get you on your way is the way I would approach it. Because I say the obvious, that immigration is going to be a challenge in the United States in the next few years. Although I expect more of that to be aimed at low-skilled immigration than high-skilled.
Well, yeah. Thank you for the insightful conversation. If you look previous to the election, the main worry of Americans was the economy, right? As normal, things like inflation, and when we read, or when I was reading some of the articles, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, comparing basically, in this case, Kamala Harris with Trump, they usually tended to say that Trump's economic policies were worse for the economy and things like inflation through tariffs or immigration borders. And even though I understand that this is a very granular problem and that each person is affected differently, the elections basically tended towards one side that apparently was considered to be worse for the economy. And I think this is happening a lot also in Europe, where the party that is gaining more momentum is usually considered the one that is worse for the economy, and people who worry first about the economy. So how do you explain this disconnect, and how can it be bridged?
It's a great question. I think for the US, it's kind of a mixed bag. It depends on the period you look at. So if you called the Trump presidency beginning of Trump until COVID, beginning of COVID, actually for working people in the country, they did much better under Trump. Part of that was public policy, but not all of it. Part of it was just in a hot economy, wages of lower skilled people were rising pretty rapidly. So until COVID hit, people weren't crazy for thinking those were good days for them. And for the Biden administration, similarly, depending on whether you start it like after the COVID period had declined somewhat or at the beginning. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And all of that is to say that you have to think about the time period, but also think about what people were actually feeling at the time. A lot of people's views about the economy are not what are my wages today, but what do I think my prospects are tomorrow? Or maybe if I'm very forward-looking, my children's prospects are. And there people tended to be more pessimistic under Biden. I'm not quite sure why, because the economy didn't, to me, look that materially different. But I think on the Trump versus Biden, it really depends on how you cut the data. I could tell the story either way, depending on where I do the start and finish.
Hello. So many analysts blame inflation and inflation of prices, but salaries have been rising too. So how would you explain inflation of prices and salaries to the general public?
Well, this is one where the general public, I think, was ahead of politicians. I think they understood. They may not have known all the words, but they understood that real wages weren't necessarily rising. And so politicians were talking about, well, but your wages are rising. Those are nominal wages. And real wages for many workers did not rise. And the prices of things they were buying in stores were higher than they remembered. So I think this is one of those where almost the economic advisors around the president were slower to react to the numbers than real people who clearly understood that this was not what they were being told. The goal is always to raise people's real incomes, not just their nominal incomes. I can assure you, Columbia's salaries didn't keep up with inflation. I'm aware that my real wages went down.
I heard that complaint from my economic professor.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
well,
so
we probably notice it more than our colleagues. But.
we can maybe squeeze in one last question if anyone has one.
What are your
I can, but I'm not sure everybody.
Okay, can you now?
Yep.
Thank you for being here. What excites you and worries you the most for the next 4 years? About the next 4 years?
I truly believe an awakening is possible. I think the American people's surprise verdict in the election has politicians on both sides of the aisle thinking, I didn't quite understand where I am. And so a set of policies that could aim for the middle and growth and opportunity and participation, I think is hugely possible. What worries me is that we double down on a wrong path of trying to persuade people it could be the past. I used to tell a joke that, 1955, Democrats want to work there and Republicans want to live there. And honestly, none of us should want to be in 1955. We should be aspiring for 2055. And so my worry is that we double down on the past. But I think there's a huge opportunity to grab the future.
I think we're going to wrap it up here.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you again,
Thank
Professor
you.
Hubbard. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you.